You know, I think it's safe to say that the whole what happens after we die thing has been bugging humans, like, forever.
Yeah, it's pretty much the ultimate mystery, right?
Totally. And in this deep dive, we're going to try and tackle that mystery.
At least we're going to explore some of the theories about the afterlife that people have come up with over the centuries.
Exactly. And I think what's so interesting is that it's not just like some abstract idea.
Hmm.
This question has really shaped so much of how we live.
Oh, absolutely. It's influenced everything, religions, cultures, how we see the world.
Right. So we're going to be looking at all sorts of things: religious doctrines, near-death experiences, philosophy, even evolutionary psychology.
We'll be looking at arguments for and against an afterlife.
We'll even unpack that neurosurgeon's claim that he has proof of heaven.
Oh, yeah, and we'll explore whether the whole idea of an afterlife is maybe just an evolutionary trick to help us deal with the fear of death.
So much to cover. Okay, so let's just start with religion. I feel like pretty much every major religion has some concept of what happens after we die.
Yeah, that's true. And a lot of times these beliefs are really tied up with cultural values and traditions.
Okay, so like, what do you mean by that?
Well, let's take Christianity, for example. You mentioned heaven and hell, right?
Yeah.
But even within Christianity, there are so many different interpretations of what heaven's actually like and how you even get there.
So it's not just as simple as like being good or bad.
Well, it can be more complicated than that. Some branches of Christianity focus more on faith, while others put more emphasis on good deeds, and even the descriptions of heaven itself can be really different. Some see it as this place of like incredible beauty, while others think of it more symbolically like a state of spiritual fulfillment.
So even within one religion, there's a lot of nuance.
Definitely a lot to unpack. What about other religions? How do they approach the afterlife?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Well, in Hinduism, you have the idea of reincarnation, where the soul is reborn into different forms based on what they did in their past
Oh,
lives.
wait, I've heard of that.
And this cycle of death and rebirth keeps going until the soul finally achieves liberation, which they call moksha. It's interesting how this belief is tied up with the Indian caste system.
How so?
Well, some Hindus believe that being reborn into a higher caste is like a reward for good behavior in a past life.
So like your past actions determine your future lives.
Exactly. And then you have Buddhism, which offers a completely different perspective.
Okay, what's the Buddhist view?
Instead of a permanent heaven or this endless cycle of reincarnation, Buddhists are trying to reach nirvana.
Nirvana.
Yeah, it's basically a state of being free from suffering and the cycle of rebirth. It's about like transcending the limitations of yourself and achieving a state of total peace and enlightenment.
That's pretty different from the other religions we've talked about.
It is, but
Right.
all of these religious beliefs seem to offer some kind of comfort.
Yeah, like there's a sense of purpose that goes beyond just our time on Earth.
Exactly. But what about people who aren't religious? Are there other ways people explore the possibility of an afterlife?
That's a good question.
Well, one thing that's gotten a lot of attention is near-death experiences, or NDEs.
Oh yeah, I've heard about those.
They often have these similar elements like a feeling of leaving your body going through a tunnel of light, or even seeing loved ones who have passed away.
Yeah, those stories can be pretty wild. In fact, one of the sources we looked at is about Dr. Eben Alexander.
Oh, yeah, the neurosurgeon?
Yeah, he claims to have visited heaven while he was in a coma. He even wrote a book about it called Proof of Heaven.
His story is definitely interesting. But you have to remember that near-death experiences happen when the brain is under a ton of stress.
Okay, so that could explain some of it.
Right. And that extreme stress can trigger some pretty unusual activity in the brain.
So some neuroscientists would say that these experiences are just the brain's way of coping with trauma.
Exactly. For example, when you have an NDE, your brain might release endorphins, which are like natural painkillers.
Oh, okay, so that could explain the feelings of euphoria or peace that people often report during an NDE.
Yeah, it could be just a chemical reaction in the brain. But then you have those cases where people claim to have seen things they couldn't have possibly known.
And that's where it gets really tough to explain.
Definitely. We also have research from Dr. Pim van Lommel, who studied NDEs in cardiac arrest survivors. And his work suggests that some things about NDEs, like heightened awareness and super clear thinking, are hard to explain with just our current understanding of how the brain works.
So are near-death experiences just our brains messing with us, or could they be glimpses into another realm? I guess there's evidence to support both sides.
It's a tough one. But before we go any further, I think we need to talk about something even bigger: consciousness.
Right, because if we're talking about an afterlife, we're basically asking, can consciousness exist without a physical body?
You got it. And philosophers have been debating that question for ages.
Yeah, it can imagine. So what are some of the different perspectives on this?
Well, our sources go into the views of philosophers like Plato and Bertrand Russell.
Okay, I've heard of them, but I'm not really familiar with their ideas.
Well, Plato believed in the soul's immortality. He thought the mind and body were separate things.
Okay, a dualistic view.
Right. And he argued that the soul, which is where our consciousness comes from, is immortal and can exist without the body.
So basically, death was just the soul being set free from the body.
In a way, yes.
Huh.
Now, Bertrand Russell, he totally disagreed with this. He was a materialist, which means he believed that everything in the universe, including consciousness, is ultimately just physical matter.
So no soul.
Right? For Russell, consciousness is tied to the brain, and when the brain dies, consciousness dies with it.
So two very different views.
Totally. And then to make things even more interesting, our sources also talk about Daniel Dennett, a modern philosopher who has a different take on materialism.
Okay, what does he say?
He argues against the idea that there's like a little you inside your head watching a movie of your life.
Yeah, I've heard that analogy before.
Right. He doesn't think consciousness is one single thing, but rather a bunch of different brain processes working together.
So more like a network than a single entity.
Exactly. And if there's no single you to begin with, it kind of throws a wrench in the whole soul surviving after death thing, right?
Yeah, that definitely complicates things.
It does. But I think what's so fascinating about all of this is that we're trying to make sense of faith and reason.
Trying to find some common ground between what we believe and what science tells us.
Exactly. And that tension is at the heart of this whole discussion about the afterlife.
Totally. It's like we're trying to solve a puzzle where faith and science both have pieces, but they don't seem to fit together.
A very complex puzzle.
But before we go any deeper, I think we should give our listeners a moment to digest all of this. What do you think?
Yeah, good idea. What's standing out to you so far? What questions are popping up? Hold on to those thoughts as we keep going with our deep dive into the afterlife.
Okay, so we're back, and we've been talking about all these different ideas about consciousness and the brain and how philosophers see it.
Yeah, and it's a lot to wrap your head around, right?
Definitely. And as we're going through all this research, one thing that keeps coming up is how many different cultures believe in an afterlife.
Oh, yeah, it's pretty universal, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like pretty much every culture throughout history has had some concept of life after death. So is it more than just wishful thinking? Could there actually be something to it?
That's the big question, right?
Yeah.
And it's one that anthropologists and evolutionary psychologists have been trying to figure out for a long time.
And what have they come up with?
Well, one theory is that the belief in an afterlife might have actually helped us survive.
Wait, really? How does that work?
So think about our early ancestors. They were dealing with all kinds of danger, like wild animals, diseases, natural disasters. I mean, they could die at any moment.
Yeah, that's a pretty harsh reality.
It was. And so the idea is that people who believed in some form of continuation after death, whether it was a spirit world or reincarnation or something else, they might have been less afraid of those dangers.
So like they were more willing to take risks because they weren't as scared of dying.
Exactly. And that could have made them more likely to explore new places, find food, and ultimately survive long enough to pass on their genes.
So basically the belief in an afterlife could have made them more resilient.
Right. And over time, those beliefs would have been passed down through generations, leading to this widespread acceptance of the afterlife that we see today.
That's a pretty interesting theory. But it also makes you wonder, if the belief in an afterlife evolved just to help us cope with death, does that mean it's not real? Is it just a story we tell ourselves?
That's a tough one. I mean, even if it started as a way to deal with fear, it doesn't necessarily mean it's meaningless. For a lot of people, it brings comfort and purpose, and that's important too.
That's true. But if it's all about mitigating the fear of death, why are there so many different versions of the afterlife?
Well, that's where culture comes in. The specific beliefs that a society develops are often shaped by their values, their social structures, even their environment.
So it's like a basic framework that gets adapted to fit different cultures.
Right. For example, in ancient Egypt, they were obsessed with preserving the body after death. So their afterlife involved journey through the underworld with all these challenges that you had to overcome to reach eternal bliss.
And that's why they mummified their dead and built these elaborate tombs.
Exactly. It all ties together. Then you have the ancient Greeks who saw the afterlife as this gloomy place called Hades, where souls just wandered around aimlessly.
It sounds pretty depressing.
Yeah, well, their worldview was focused on the idea that life is fleeting and death is inevitable, so their version of the afterlife reflects that.
So even though the fear of death might be universal, the way we imagine the afterlife is really specific to each culture.
Exactly. And as cultures change, their beliefs about the afterlife can change too.
Okay, so we've talked about religious beliefs, near-death experiences, and this evolutionary perspective. But what about science? Is there any scientific evidence to support the idea of life after death?
That's where it gets really tricky. From a purely scientific point of view, proving or disproving the afterlife is incredibly difficult.
I imagine it's kind of like trying to measure a ghost with a ruler. Just doesn't seem possible.
Yeah, good analogy. The way we do science is all about studying things we can observe and measure. Consciousness and whether it can exist outside the body is beyond that.
So does that mean science will never be able to tell us anything about the afterlife?
Not necessarily. There are some scientists who are trying to study it in new ways.
Like how?
Well, some researchers are looking at near-death experiences, trying to see if there are any specific patterns of brain activity that match up with what people describe.
And what about those stories of people communicating with the dead? Is there any scientific basis for that?
There's a whole field called parapsychology that looks into things like telepathy, clairvoyance, and communication with the dead. They've done some interesting studies, but the results are often hard to interpret, and there's not a lot of consensus.
So it sounds like we're back to this tension between faith and reason.
Yeah, I think so. The question of the afterlife really pushes the limits of what we know and forces us to confront the difference between what we can prove scientifically and what we believe based on faith or intuition.
Which is what makes this whole topic so fascinating. It's a mystery we might never solve, but the search for answers is what's important.
I agree. It makes us think about big questions like the nature of consciousness, the meaning of life, our place in the universe. These are questions that don't always have easy answers.
Well said. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this part. I think it's time to give our listeners another moment to process everything.
Yeah, definitely. Let all this information sink in.
But before we do, I want to leave you with a question to think about. Imagine for a second that we could know for sure whether or not there's an afterlife. How would that change your life, your values, your actions? It's something to ponder as we move into our final segment. All right, so we're back for our final thoughts on all things afterlife.
Yeah, and after all these different perspectives and theories, one thing that really sticks out to me is how personal this whole topic is.
Right? It's not just some abstract idea.
Yeah.
It's something that people really struggle with on a deep level.
It really shapes how people see the world, their hopes, fears, everything.
And I think what makes it so interesting is that there's no easy answer. We've got faith on one side, science on the other, and this huge mystery in the middle.
And even if science could somehow prove or disprove the afterlife, I think we'd still be left with those big questions.
Like what?
Like, what is consciousness really? What's the meaning of life? What happens to who we are when we die?
Those are questions that people have been asking forever.
Right. And we might not ever have the answers, but I think searching for them is what matters.
Yeah, it makes you think about your own life and what you believe.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Makes us think about our own mortality and appreciate all the different ways people make sense of the world.
You know, as we've been talking about all this, I keep coming back to that question you asked before
Which one?
about how knowing for sure whether there's an afterlife would change how we live.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. Makes you think, doesn't it?
Totally.
Yeah.
Would we take more risks if we knew there were no consequences? Or would we be more careful if we thought we might have to answer for our actions later on?
It's hard to say, but I do think that even just the possibility of an afterlife can make us want to live better lives.
Yeah, like it gives you a sense of purpose.
Right. Like our lives have meaning even beyond just our time on Earth.
And even if it turns out that there isn't an afterlife, I think going through this whole process of exploring it can make us more aware of how precious life is.
I think that's a really important point. Just thinking about these things can make us more present, more grateful for what we have, more compassionate towards others.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe that's the biggest takeaway from all of this. Whether or not there's something after this life, what we have right now is what matters.
It's all about making the most of the time we have.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we encourage you to keep thinking about these questions. What do you believe happens after we die? How does that belief affect your life? What's truly important to you?
These are questions we all need to ask ourselves.
And maybe someday science will be able to give us more answers about consciousness and the afterlife. But until then, the exploration goes on.
Thanks for joining us on this journey.
And keep those big questions coming.